moving, KHOU is grooving. I'm feeling it 'cause it's gonna be. We're about to get it going. Our happiness is showing. We're rocking it 'cause it's gonna be. Great day. Great day in Houston. Great day.
And now, here's your host, Deborah Duncan.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Great Day Houston. Okay, so they say practice makes perfect. If that's the case, modern humans have been doing this for about 200,000 years. And guess what? It's still not perfect. What am I talking about? Raising children. On today's show, we're answering your questions from newborns to toddlers, terrible twos, tweens, and teens. How do we build the best foundation for their adulthood to stand on? Joining us with tips on the toughest job you'll ever love are two people who are on the front lines. Dr. Joan Shook, the Chief Safety Officer at Texas Children's Hospital. Her specialty is emergency medicine, and when it's our baby, it's always an emergency, right? And psychiatrist Dr. Tarnow at the Tarnow Center for Self-Management. He specializes in many things, including ADD, ADHD, autism, and oppositional disorder, which I think oppositional disorder is the medical term for teenager. All right, good morning.
Good morning.
And thank you all very much for being with us. Okay, let's start with when we get the baby home. And all of us have this perfect little thing there, and we want to protect that perfect little thing. I'm going to start with something that somebody just asked me the other day. She was concerned about, and that was, do I get my child the vaccinations? As you know, this whole subject came up again when we had celebrities saying that they thought that vaccinations are what caused the problem for their kids. And so let's look at the bite from Jenny McCarthy.
Evan was diagnosed with autism in 2005. Without a doubt in my mind, I believe vaccinations triggered Evan's autism. We do believe, because we were the witness with our child, our firsthand witness after we came home from the doctor's office and saw this regression of a child that was perfect and then slowly fading away.
All right. I know, Dr. Shook, you have a very definite opinion on this, and so I'd like to hear that.
Well, let me start with this. I feel like it's our obligation to protect infants and young children, all children really, with everything we possibly can so that they can grow up and be responsible, healthy adults.
Right.
What Jenny McCarthy just referred to is really one of the great lies, honestly, in healthcare today. There is no evidence, let me say it one more time, no evidence to suggest that in any way does a vaccine cause autism. That has been completely debunked. In fact, that was built on a false study that was on 9 patients. It was clear that it was wrong. It was completely made up, and it's been withdrawn from the literature.
But it got out there. I know
it got out there.
The thing is, autism is real. I think what a lot of parents are struggling with is trying to explain how it happens, right?
Absolutely. And one of the things that happens is that you get a vaccine at 15 months of life, couple vaccines that are really important to keep your immunity going for you. And that's also the time when language develops and the time when families discover that their language and their other social skills are not developing appropriately. So it is true that it sort of coexists in time where you are getting a vaccine and somebody's saying, hey, my child isn't speaking the way he should.
So it's all a correlation in time, but it just is a coincidental correlation.
Correct.
All right.
Correct.
So what is autism?
Well, autism is interference with development of language as well as social relationships. So the social relationships is the important thing in terms of the difficulty that autistic children have. And the most important way to communicate, right, is language.
Right.
So that's how it comes out in terms of those two things.
When do we first kind of notice something's different?
Around 18 months. Because what happens at 18 months, 2 years, around that period of time is when language develops. So when the development of language is occurring, you get to see those children falling behind and having difficulty.
All right. One of the other things that people deal with right away, my son was 9'5" when he was born. He was hungry like every 10 minutes. Yeah,
that's a big baby.
I couldn't do it. I could not. I could not do it. So we know that people oftentimes have the debate of should breastfeed or formula, breastfeed or formula, and are you doing a disservice if you aren't breastfeeding?
Well, the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that you exclusively breastfeed for the first 6 months of life. That's not possible for every woman, but let me explain why it's important. When you think sort of that, you mentioned the evolution of human beings just a little while ago. Babies evolved at the same time that lactation evolved. What's really important about that breast milk is sometimes we just think about calories and large nutrients. The micronutrients are particularly attuned to the needs of that infant at that moment in time. The composition of breast milk changes as the baby's needs change. So in effect, what breast milk is able to do is build a scaffolding for the development that that baby is ready to perform.
Yeah.
It's particularly important with the neural development, the brain and the central nervous system, but really all the organs are really perfectly attuned to that breast milk. And formula, I understand why people go in that direction. It's frequently really hard to both work and breastfeed and do all those things. If you read everything about formula, they're trying really hard to mimic breast milk.
Right, to make it bioidentical if they can.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But they can't. The things that they are lacking are the immunoglobulins, the natural immunity factors, those kinds of things, which really have been demonstrated over and over again to make healthier babies. Fewer ear infections, fewer colds, fewer pneumonias, fewer other significant problems, including diabetes. I mean, big, big problems.
Okay, the brain. Every parent thinks that their child is the smartest one. In fact, the other day when I went to a baby showing, the baby is 2 months old, and she goes, "Look how smart he is. His eyes are following us." Right? But we shouldn't dismiss that we're having an impact on the brain, just even through touch, through talking to our child. How important is that?
Well, it's very, very important, and that's the other part of breastfeeding, which is really very, very helpful, is the relationship between the infant and the mother. And that forces a relationship, right, with breastfeeding. But the other thing is it's all that touch and smell and feel and interaction, eye contact, which is very, very helpful for a sense of basic trust, because that's your first relationship is with a mother. And that basic trust that I can depend on you and I can feel you is very important for the rest of development.
In fact, we see that the children who didn't have touch early on, you can see how that impacts them in a very negative way oftentimes.
Absolutely, yeah. And you know, it's sort of old news now, but we had this problem with adopting babies from Russia. And one of the problems is a lot of those babies in Russia were in orphanages where they didn't have touch. As a matter of fact, they were still eating gruel. They weren't eating solid foods at the age of 3 and 4. So that early development, we have a lot of research that tell us about the importance of that early mother-infant relationship.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be mothers.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, it could be
fathers,
mothers, a whole bit. But it's the fact of having human relationship, human touch. All right. When your child should be walking, that's the other thing that we do. Is like, well, my child was walking at 2 months. It's like, wow, look at you. I'd rather you have an Olympic athlete there. But you know, and so we always strive as parents to see what is normal. So if your child's not walking by a certain time, when is that time for you to say, we need to get back into the doctor's office?
Well, I'd say that it's really important to have a relationship with a pediatric healthcare provider, and that could be a pediatrician, family physician, whoever works best into your life, and they can help you monitor that. A development occurs along a very predictable progression. Most kids walk somewhere between 10 and 18 months, but that's a pretty
10 and 18 is a wide, wide range.
And you just have to have somebody who's helping you be aware of what the normal milestones are and the normal neurodevelopment.
I think that's so important, is to be aware of that no individual is exactly the same, and they're not coming from a book. You know, that they're just real. And so there's a real variation in terms of how kids develop. I'm amazed, and being in practice for such a long time, seeing kids, 30 years later, and seeing kids develop tremendously different, even though in the first 5 years of life, they were having so many difficulties with walking, coordination, speech, and yet
even learning disabilities. I remember one day you were coming out of your office and you had tears in your eyes, and you said, "I'm sorry." That young man came back to visit me, and it was a young man who I'm guessing had some big struggles in learning disability that he had, but had graduated from college.
Yes, yes. Oh, I have students who've grown up and who are now investment bankers and doctors and
Yeah.
have achieved wonderful things
Yeah.
despite all their disabilities.
And by the way, a little bit later on, we're going to talk about those learning disabilities, you know, because I know so many parents struggle with that. And still in society, I think some people struggle with, is it real or not? Kind of like with mental illness. They go, well, is that really real or are you just a lazy child? We'll talk about that
Well, you know what?
in a
The
minute.
thing I'm most concerned about, though, is what you were talking about twice, is making comparisons.
Yes, and if you go on Facebook, just stay off Facebook when you have a new baby because everybody's child is perfect and beautiful and yours needs to keep up.
And people have to realize, parents have to realize, that puts too much pressure on the children.
Yeah.
Because then the parents are sort of seeing this child as a representation of them. And
You feel like you're the failure.
and you're the failure, but also you're putting this pressure onto a child who has no idea about what's going on
Yeah.
except to feel bad.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes parents need to kind of keep it in their minds that there's no evidence to suggest that if you walk at 10 months, you're much more likely to be an Olympic athlete. There's nothing like that.
Right.
It's just sort of the normal neurodevelopmental progression for that child.
Yeah,
Exactly
and
as
again,
Dr.
your
Jones
point
was
that you
saying.
made, have a relationship with the doctor, not necessarily with social media to see what everybody else's
Well,
child is doing.
totally
All right.
agree with that.
When we come back, the only way they'll go to sleep is if you let them sleep with you. They're a toddler, so you give in. But now you're wondering, when will they get out? The family bed and other issues you deal with as your child grows.